You're listening to Almost Alone, where we share real stories submitted by viewers. Every story you hear comes from someone who wrote in to tell their experience. For privacy, all names and details are changed unless permission is explicitly given. Tonight, we're going into the woods. 3 trips, 3 different campsites, and 3 people who walked back out, but never felt alone there again. I went camping alone for the first time in 3 years after a rough stretch at work. I'm an IT guy at a hospital, and I just spent 2 months on call, sleeping in 2-hour blocks and living on caffeine and vending machine food. When that finally ended, I didn't want a beach or a city. I wanted to hear nothing mechanical for a couple of days. No beeping monitors, no phone notifications, no elevator chimes, just wind and maybe some water. There's a state forest about 2 hours from me that I'd car camped in before, but this time I wanted to be a little more isolated, so I picked a walk-in site on the far side of a small creek. It was still a designated campsite, just not one people usually chose because you had to carry your stuff in about half a mile. I got there in the late afternoon on a Friday. The parking lot was mostly empty, just one other sedan with a bike rack. It was early in the season, still cold at night, with barely any bugs yet. I checked in at the little office, got my permit, and the ranger circled my site on the laminated map. "Quiet over there this time of year," he said. "Probably have it to yourself." That was exactly what I wanted. The walk-in was peaceful. The trail followed the creek, which was only about 10 feet wide and shallow. Clear water over rocks, loud enough to cover distant noise, but soft enough that you could still hear anything close. My site was on a flat patch of ground, set back from the water. Someone had built a ring of rocks for fires, and there was a single post with the campsite number screwed into it. Behind it, dense trees. In front of it, the creek. I set up my small gray tent, hung my food bag from a tree branch, and made myself an early dinner. The air got cooler once the sun dipped behind the trees, and the woods took on that blue, shadowy tone where you start to feel like you're inside a closed space instead of outside. I was sitting on a log, stirring my little camp stove, when I noticed light across the creek. At first I thought it was a reflection from the sky, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a lantern, not a campfire. Just a single dull yellow light hanging under a dark tarp. The tarp was strung low between 2 trees, maybe 30 or 40 yards directly across from my site. Under it, I could make out 3 shapes sitting in a row. No tent I could see, no other gear, just the tarp and the lantern, and those 3 people facing my direction. I hadn't seen anyone on my hike in, and I hadn't heard anyone setting up. It felt like they'd been there the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed, but I knew that wasn't true. I remember telling myself that my brain was just shifting from busy hospital noise to forest quiet, that it was fine. People camp. Still, I felt weirdly exposed. I raised a hand in an awkward wave, just to acknowledge them. No one waved back. They didn't move at all. I could tell they were looking this way, but couldn't see their faces. The lantern lit them from behind, so they were almost silhouettes. "Okay," I said out loud to myself, a little too loudly. "Other campers, cool." I ate my food, cleaned my little pot, and tried to ignore them. As it got darker, I expected to hear the usual camping noises from across the creek. Someone chopping wood, unzipping a tent, talking, laughing, a fire crackling. There was nothing. The lantern stayed at the same dim level. No campfire started, no voices, just the creek and the occasional wind through the branches. I crawled into my tent around 10, read a bit on my Kindle, and eventually turned off my headlamp. The creek noise was calming, but every now and then I'd think about those 3 shapes sitting across the water, completely silent, lit from behind. At some point I drifted off. I don't know what time I woke up, but it was fully dark and cold enough that I could see my breath inside the tent. What woke me was the sound of water being disturbed, gentle splashing, like someone carefully stepping in a stream. I lay there listening. It wasn't just one splash. It was a sequence, with pauses in between. One or two steps, then silence. Another couple steps. The creek isn't deep, but it's wide enough that you can't just hop it. You have to commit to getting both feet wet. My first thought was that it was a deer, but the steps were too deliberate, and I couldn't hear any snorting or rustling. The splashes got louder, then faded, as if something had crossed at a diagonal, passed near my sight, and then moved downstream. I was fully awake at that point, heart beating fast, mouth dry. I considered unzipping the tent and shining my light, but some part of me didn't want to see anything. I told myself it was just an animal and forced myself to lie still. Eventually, the creek and wind sounds blended together again, and I must have fallen back asleep. In the morning, it was bright and crisp. The cold had kept my breath in the air. I made coffee and oatmeal, feeling stupid about how tense I'd been in the night. When I looked across the creek, I saw the tarp and the lantern. The tarp had a slight sag in the middle. The lantern was off. The three figures were still there, sitting. But now, in daylight, I could see more. They were wearing dark jackets, hoods up, heads down slightly. Their chairs were set in a neat row, all facing directly toward my campsite, angled just enough that they all shared the same line of sight. Still no other gear. No cooler, no sleeping bags, no fire ring. Just them and that tarp. I waved again. Nothing. I thought about calling over, saying something neutral like, "Morning," but it felt like the kind of silence you don't break. When I went to check my food bag, I noticed it hung differently. The knot I'd tied was now slightly higher, tighter than I remembered. I'm meticulous about stuff like that. I untied it and opened the bag. Everything was there, nothing missing, but it was all rearranged. The granola bars were in a neat line, all turned label side up. The oatmeal packets were stacked by flavor. The little bottle of whiskey I'd brought was right at the top, cap slightly loosened. If a raccoon had somehow opened it, there would have been claw marks, ripped packaging, scattering. This was deliberate. The hair went up on the back of my neck. I checked the ground around the tree. There were footprints in the damp earth, but they were faint and trampled over by my own. I couldn't tell how many or from when. I forced myself to act normal. I made my breakfast, sat on my log, and tried not to constantly glance across the creek. They didn't move. Around midday, I walked the trail a bit with just my water bottle, hoping I'd run into someone else. I didn't. The only sound was the creek when I got back. The second evening, I debated packing up early, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. I'd planned for 2 nights. It felt ridiculous to be chased out by some weird, silent campers who hadn't actually done anything to me. As the light faded, I checked their side again. The tarp had been moved. It was closer to the creek now, maybe 10 feet from the water line instead of 20. The lantern was already on, its dim halo backlighting them. Their chairs were still facing my direction. It felt like they'd inched closer, not to the creek in general, but to me. I tried to eat dinner without staring. My hand shook a little while I cut cheese and sausage. I dropped my knife once and cursed under my breath. Night settled in faster than I expected. I didn't stay up to gaze at the stars. I got into my tent earlier than usual, zipped it shut, and lay there listening. The creek, wind, cracking branches somewhere deeper in the woods. I must have dozed, because the next thing I remember is waking up with my heart pounding, in that way where your body knows something is wrong before your brain does. The creek sounded different, quieter in a way. Then I realized I could hear something over it. Breathing. Very slow, controlled breathing, just outside my tent. I held my own breath and listened harder. It was maybe a foot or two from my head, on the other side of the nylon. Inhale, long pause, exhale. No shuffling, no other sound. Just someone standing still and breathing. My mind tried to rationalize it as an animal, but there's a specific cadence humans have when they breathe quietly. The little catch at the top of the inhale. The subtle difference in the weight of the exhale. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my light. My phone was off in my bag at my feet, but even if it had been in my hand, there was no service out there. The breathing continued for what felt like several minutes. My shoulders burned from staying so rigid. Then suddenly, the creak sound came back up, like someone had taken their hand off a volume knob. I realized my ears had just adjusted. The breathing was gone. I lay there for a long time after that, until my body finally forced me into a shallow, restless sleep. At first light, I got out, packed up everything mechanically, and didn't even bother with breakfast. I did a quick scan of the ground around my tent. There were faint impressions in the earth, like someone had stood there for a while and turned slowly. Not distinct footprints, just flattened patches against the normal texture. When I looked across the creek, the tarp was still there, but the lantern was gone. The chairs were empty. Whoever they were, they hadn't broken camp. They just vanished. No footsteps leading away along the bank, at least nothing obvious. I didn't call out to them. I just hoisted my pack, tied my trash to it, and started back down the trail. The walk out felt longer. The forest was bright and harmless, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone just stepping behind a tree. When I reached the parking lot, the same sedan with the bike rack was still there. The ranger's truck was parked near the office. I went in to check out and drop off the laminated map. The ranger from the day before was behind the desk, flipping through paperwork. "Back already?" he asked. I shrugged. "Yeah, just wanted one full day out." He made a note on a clipboard. "All good up there?" I hesitated. "Hey, were there other campers near my site? Across the creek? 3 people under a tarp?" He frowned and pulled the main map over, tracing his finger to my site. "Across the creek from you is protected area," he said. "No public sites over there. That whole side's been closed the last couple years." "Closed?" I repeated. "Yeah. Erosion, some habitat stuff. We don't issue permits on that side. You said you saw campers over there?" I looked down at my boots. They were muddy from the walk. A small leaf was stuck to one shoelace. "They might have just been off-trail hikers," I said finally. "I didn't go over to check." He nodded, but he watched me for a second longer than was comfortable. I signed my name, handed him the map, and walked back out to my car. On the drive home, I kept seeing that tarp in my mind. Those 3 shapes, sitting perfectly still, facing me. The rearranged food, the tightened knot, the breathing on the other side of the nylon. I've been back to that forest since, but only for day hikes, and only on clearly marked trails near other people. I never camped near a creek alone again. I've kept backpacking trip logs since I was a teenager. Mileage, weather, any wildlife, what I ate, how I slept. It's my way of making sure the days don't blur together into just that one time in the woods. 2 years ago, I started a 3-day loop in a national forest a few states over. It was early October, midweek. The leaves had just started to change, and I'd requested vacation specifically to avoid crowds. The trail I chose has these old-fashioned registers at certain junctions, metal boxes with hinged lids, mounted to posts. Inside, there's a notebook and a pencil. You write your name, the date, which direction you're going, and sometimes a short note. I signed into the first one at the trailhead, like always. Name, date, loop clockwise. The last person had signed in 3 days earlier, going the opposite direction. I hiked about 8 miles that first day and made camp near a small lake. It was uneventful in a good way. I could see my breath that night, and the only sounds were insects and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning I broke camp and hiked another 6 or 7 miles to the next junction where the second register was supposed to be. It was there, half hidden in some brush. The box was rusty but functional. When I opened it, the cold metal creaked. The top page had my trailhead entry from the day before. Under it, in a different handwriting, was a new line. It was written directly below my name, in the same format, just without a date or direction. It said, "Nice to see you again." That was it. No signature. For a moment, I thought I was looking at my own writing. The pencil marks were about the same darkness, and the letters were roughly similar in size. But the way the N in nice curved was different from mine. The G in again had a loop at the bottom. I scanned the previous pages for the same handwriting. Nothing. Just people's names, initials, little jokes. I told myself it was probably some kid being cute. Maybe someone I'd passed on another trip who recognized my name. Still, there was a hollow feeling in my stomach as I closed the box and kept walking. The rest of the day was normal. The trail climbed gradually, and I ended up camping on a ridge that overlooked a valley of orange and red trees. I cooked ramen, watched the sunset, and wrote my own note in my personal log. Light breeze 40 seconds at night. 1 set of coyote tracks. Register message weird, but probably nothing. I slept okay. On the second day, the trail cut through a dense section of spruce and pine. The trees were so close in some spots that branches scraped my pack. The light got dim and greenish. Around noon, I reached the third junction, another register box. I almost walked past it. I remember thinking, don't obsess, it's just a box. But habit made me stop. Inside the same notebook type, I flipped to the latest page. My name was there again, from earlier that morning at the last box. Below it, the same handwriting as before. This time it said, "Blue tent. Ramen again." I stared at it for a long time. I do have a blue tent, and I had eaten ramen the night before. Those aren't exactly uncommon, but something about the combination made my skin feel too tight. There had been no one around my campsite, no flashlights in the distance, no voices. I hadn't even seen any fresh footprints on the trail. The mud had my prints and the faint edges of older ones, dried and cracked. I looked behind me down the trail. It was empty, just a line of dirt stretching between trees. I listened. The woods were silent in that way, where you know they're not actually silent. You've just tuned everything out. I turned back to the notebook and checked the previous entries again. No similar handwriting. No one had written above my name or below it for days. It was just me, and whoever wrote that. I wrote a short entry. "John, continuing clockwise. Please don't write about my campsite again." It felt stupid immediately, like I was scolding a ghost. I closed the box and kept moving, but the rhythm of my steps got weird. I'd walk faster, then slow down to listen behind me, then speed up again. That night I camped near a small clearing by a stream. It was objectively a perfect spot. Soft ground, close water, a nice flat rock to sit on. I couldn't enjoy it. I hung my food, set up the tent, and sat there with my stove off for a long time, listening. At some point, I forced myself to cook. Ramen again. It's light and easy, and I'm a creature of habit. I ate fast, watching the tree line the entire time. When the sun went down, I really felt how alone I was. The sky turned dark purple, the trees became a black wall, and the stream sounded louder than it had in daylight. I got into my tent around 9 and zipped it up carefully. My headlamp cast a little cone of light inside, turning the blue fabric into a soft glow. I read until my eyes hurt, then turned the light off and lay in the dark, listening to the stream and the occasional twig snapping. Somewhere around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow and measured, just outside the range of my comfort zone, maybe 20 feet away. Not right next to the tent, but close enough that I could hear individual leaves crunching. They paced, back and forth. I held my breath every time they stopped, waiting to hear the zipper of my tent, or a voice, or anything. Nothing. Just the steps again, circling. Every so often they'd pause directly behind my head, where the tent was thinnest. I could feel the presence in that way you can sense someone standing behind you, even with your eyes closed. I didn't call out. I wish I could say I did, that I challenged whoever it was. But I stayed silent, staring at the dark ceiling of my tent and counting my breaths. Eventually, the footsteps faded. Either they walked away quietly, or my brain couldn't distinguish them from normal forest sounds anymore. I slept in short, shallow bursts after that. In the gray, early morning light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The ground was damp. There were footprints. At least 2 different sizes, maybe more, overlapping. Not bare feet, boots. But the treads were faint, like someone had deliberately stepped lightly. They formed a rough circle around my tent, then trailed off into the trees, disappearing where the soil turned to leaf litter. I packed up quickly. No breakfast, just water and a protein bar in my hand as I walked. The final register was at a junction about 4 miles from the trailhead. My plan had been to take a side spur and add another night, but as soon as I saw that box, I knew I was done. I was going home. The box creaked when I opened it. My fingers felt clumsy. My name was there again from several hours earlier at the last junction. Under it, in the same careful handwriting, "See you back home." This time, there was something else. 2 words, written like a nickname. It was a name I hadn't heard since I was 10 years old. A slightly embarrassing childhood nickname my sister used to call me. Something I would never put on a public form or email. I read it and felt the world narrow down to that line of graphite on paper. I flipped through every previous page. No sign of that handwriting except under my entries. No sign of the nickname anywhere else. I didn't leave a note that time. I closed the notebook, shut the box, and walked the rest of the way out without stopping. At the trailhead, there were 2 other cars in the gravel lot. I scanned the faces of the people nearby, but they were just day hikers, older couple, young guy with headphones. None of them even glanced at me. The drive home felt unreal. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following at an exact, unchanging distance. When I got to my apartment, everything looked the same. Door locked, mail piled in the little metal box, plants dried out, but still alive. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. My couch was where I left it, TV off, dishes still in the sink. I walked into my bedroom and dropped my pack on the floor. My desk is against the wall, next to the window. I keep my maps in a neat stack in the corner. The map for this particular trail had been on top when I left. I know because I folded it and set it there while planning. Now it was still on top, but folded differently. Not in the simple rectangle I do, but in a long, narrow strip that highlighted the section of the loop I had just walked. There was a new crease down the exact mileage I'd covered. Someone had unfolded it completely, smoothed it out, then refolded it in a way that drew a straight line from the trailhead to that last register. I walked through my apartment like I was in a museum, not touching anything, just looking. There was no sign of a break-in, no scratch marks on the door, no windows cracked, nothing missing. But the map had changed, and someone out in that forest had used a name they shouldn't know. I still hike, but I avoid trails with registers when I can. When I do have to sign one, I only write my initials, and I don't read the entries beneath mine anymore. I just close the box and walk on, pretending that the next line is blank. Two summers ago, my friend Luke and I decided to do a long weekend in a national forest we'd never been to before. He'd just gone through a breakup, and I was between jobs. Getting out of the city felt like the right kind of reset. The plan was simple. Hiking about 10 miles on Friday, make camp by a river, spend Saturday fishing and exploring, then hike back out Sunday. The trail was marked with these little wooden posts every mile, each one burned with a number. Mile 1, Mile 2, and so on. It was oddly comforting, knowing exactly how far you'd gone. We started late in the morning. It was hot, but under the trees the temperature dropped enough that we weren't miserable. We saw two groups of hikers in the first couple miles, then nobody. By late afternoon, we passed mile marker 41. The woods changed slightly there. Less underbrush, more tall, straight trunks spaced wider apart. The ground got sandier, and we started hearing water in the distance. Somewhere between 41 and 42, Luke pointed off trail. "Look," he said, "fire ring." About 30 yards off, through the trees, we could see a circle of rocks and what looked like a log set up as a bench. It wasn't on the map as an official site, but people make their own spots all the time. We followed the faint path over. What we found was more than just a casual, unofficial campsite. There was a tent set up, a decent one, dark green with the rainfly on. The door was zipped halfway, not completely closed, like someone had just stepped out and expected to come right back. Next to it were two camp chairs, angled toward a small fire ring. The fire itself was mostly ash, but when the breeze shifted we could see a faint orange glow and a wisp of smoke. On a flat rock nearby was a blackened pot with something burned into the bottom. It smelled vaguely like beans or chili, overcooked to the point of being one solid crust. There was also a phone on the rock, face down. No one was there. "Hello?" Luke called out. "Hey, anybody around?" Silence. Just the river somewhere beyond, muffled by trees. We looked at each other. "They probably just went to the water," I said. "Or, bathroom." "Yeah," Luke said slowly. "Maybe." But there was something off about the scene. For one, there was no cooler, no visible food, no bags of chips, no grocery sacks, no backpacks in sight either. I picked up the phone. It was a newer Android, no case. When I pressed the side button, nothing happened. I turned it over. The back panel was off, and the battery was missing entirely. "Okay, that's weird," I said. Luke was looking at the chairs. "These are warm," he said, putting his hand on one of the armrests. Like someone was just sitting here. The fire wasn't actively burning, but if you kicked the ash, little embers glowed red. I called out again, louder. "Hello, anyone camping here?" No response. We both stood there listening for a long moment. You can usually hear a person moving through the woods, branches snapping, leaves crunching. There was nothing but the constant low rush of the river. Luke shrugged. "Maybe they went for a swim," he said. "Left everything here." "Without the phone battery?" I said. "And no packs?" He didn't have an answer for that. We debated what to do. It felt wrong to touch anything else, and we didn't know if someone was hurt or just off doing something. The nearest ranger station was back near the trailhead, 10 miles away. "It's going to be dark in a couple hours," I said. "If we go back now, we're hiking most of the way in the dark. If we keep going, we'll be out of time to turn around if something's actually wrong." We ended up splitting the difference. Our planned campsite, according to the map, was another half-mile down, closer to the river bend. We decided to stick with the original plan, but set up our tent closer than usual to the main trail, just in case we needed to leave in a hurry. As we walked away from the empty site, I kept glancing back, waiting to see someone emerge from the trees, dripping wet from the river, waving and saying something like, "Hey, sorry, bathroom run." No one showed up. We passed mile marker 42, then found a flat space near the water where others had clearly camped before. Stone ring, logs for seats. We set up the tent, a dull orange one we'd shared on a bunch of trips. Luke went to collect water and I started a small fire. We didn't talk much. The image of that half-zipped tent and the silent chairs sat between us. As the sky dimmed, the forest took on that closed-in feeling. Sound carried strangely. I could faintly hear the river hitting rocks upstream, though I couldn't see it through the trees. At one point, Luke said, "We should go back and check again before it's totally dark, just to be sure." I was thinking the same thing. We grabbed our headlamps, but didn't turn them on yet, just carried them in our hands and walked back up the trail toward mile marker 42. When we reached the little side path, I knew something was different even before we stepped off the main trail. The smell of smoke was weaker. The air felt emptier. We walked to the clearing. The tent was still there, but it had collapsed. Poles were still threaded through the fabric, but the whole thing had been pushed down, like someone had thrown themselves onto it or stomped on it. The chairs were gone. The rock with the pot was there. The pot itself was tipped over on the ground. Burned food fused inside. The phone was gone. Luke turned in a slow circle, scanning with his eyes. "Hello?" He called again. "Hey, you okay?" Nothing. It was getting dark enough that the trees were turning into silhouettes. I turned on my headlamp. The beam cut through the dimness, lighting up the tent and the ground around it. No new footprints that I could see, just trampled dirt and some scuffs from where the tent had been pushed down. Something about the whole setup gave me a tight feeling in my chest. Someone had returned, done something, and left again, all in the time between our passing and our coming back. "We should go," I said. Luke nodded, already backing toward the trail. We got back to our campsite just as the last of the light was leaving the sky. The trees became a black wall around us. We ate quickly and kept the fire small. At one point, Luke said, "We'll go to the ranger in the morning. It's probably nothing, but we should tell someone." I agreed. We got into the tent around 10, leaving the dying fire to crackle down to coals. I fell asleep faster than I expected, considering how unsettled I was. Exhaustion will do that. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not just one or two, a pattern. Crunch, pause, crunch, crunch, longer pause. They were moving around our tent, not running, not sneaking, just walking. I nudged Luke. "You hear that?" I whispered. He was already awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. "Yeah," he whispered back. We listened. The steps circled slowly, then stopped near the entrance. For a moment, I thought I could hear breathing through the fabric. Luke reached toward the zipper and I grabbed his wrist. I shook my head in the dimness. I didn't know why, but the idea of unzipping that door and shining a light on whoever, or whatever, was out there felt worse than not knowing. After a long, still stretch, the footsteps moved away. We lay there, muscles tense, until eventually they faded completely into the general noise of the forest. I don't know how much sleep we got after that. It felt like I was awake the whole time, drifting just enough to lose track of the hours. At first light, we got out of the tent. Around our campsite, in the sandier parts of the ground, were footprints. They weren't boots. They were bare feet. You could see the toe shapes clearly, the arch, the heel. They were adult-sized, not small. They formed a loose circle around our tent, with a few prints leading closer to the fire ring and then back. The prints didn't come from the trail. They just started near the edge of our campsite and disappeared into the underbrush in 3 different directions, like whoever it was had walked in a zigzag, careful not to leave a straight, obvious path. Luke stared at them, jaw tight. "Okay," he said. "We're done. Let's go." We didn't even make coffee. We packed with that frantic efficiency you get when you're scared, but trying not to show it. On the way back past mile marker 42, we didn't go check the empty campsite. Neither of us even suggested it. We both just kept walking. A couple miles down, we started hearing something behind us. It sounded like someone stepping on branches, not constantly, just every time we slowed down. If we stopped completely, it stopped too. We'd walk, and a few seconds later, crack. We'd pick up the pace, and there'd be nothing for a while. Then, if we caught our breath and our speed dropped, another crack from the trees off to the side or behind us. It felt intentional, like whoever was making the noise wanted us to know they were there, but didn't want to be seen. Once Luke spun around, scanning the trees, breathing hard. "Hey," he shouted, "if you need help, come out." The forest swallowed his voice. No answer. We started walking again, faster now. The branch noises resumed, always just behind us, just off the trail, never visible. At some point, the fear shifted from someone might be hurt to someone might be playing with us. Neither option felt good. We reached the trailhead in what felt like half the time it had taken us to walk in. The parking area was almost empty. 1 pickup, 1 sedan, our car. As soon as we stepped into the open gravel, the noises stopped. No more snapping branches, no movement in the trees. We stood there catching our breath, looking back at the line where the woods ended. "Ranger Station," Luke said. We drove over. It was a small building with a front desk and some faded posters about campfire safety. An older man in a uniform came out from the back, surprised to see anyone that early. We told him everything. The empty campsite, the tent, the warm chairs, the phone with no battery, the collapsed tent and missing chairs later, the bare footprints around our own site, the person pacing us out by stepping on branches. He listened, nodding slowly, hands clasped in front of him. When we finished, he said, "You remember exactly where that first site was?" "Between 41 and 42, I said. "Closer to 42. He took out a laminated map and had us point. "People aren't supposed to camp there," he said. "But they do. We try to check unofficial sites when we can, make sure nobody's doing anything stupid." "Could someone be in trouble?" Luke asked. The ranger's eyes flicked between us. "If you're asking if we've had missing persons out there recently, no," he said. "Not in the last couple years anyway." He wrote down some notes and said he'd send someone to check it out. We waited in the station for about half an hour, drinking bad coffee from a styrofoam cup, but no one came back with an update. Eventually, the ranger said, "You guys should head home. We'll take a look. If anything comes up, we have your numbers on the permit." We left. No one ever called. A week later, it still bothered me enough that I phoned the ranger station myself. A different person answered. When I described the empty campsite near mile marker 42, there was a pause. Then he said, "We checked that area, didn't find a setup like what you described. Just an old fire ring and some trash. Probably from a bunch of different groups over the years." "What about a tent?" I asked. "Collapsed green. A pot with burned food. Phone." "Nothing like that when we were there," he said. "If someone left it, they came back and got it before we did." I thanked him and hung up. I still think about those bare footprints in the sand, circling our tent, the half-zip tent at the unofficial site, the warm chairs with no owners, the missing phone battery. We weren't the only ones out there that weekend. We just never saw who else was. That was 3 true disturbing camping trips from listeners who thought they were just getting away for a quiet weekend. The woods don't have to be haunted to be hostile. Sometimes it's enough to know there was someone watching you and you never saw their face. If you've had a similar experience or a story of your own, you can use the Google link in the description to submit it. You never know. Your story might be next.